Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nick Turner. I am I serve as the president of the Vera Institute of Justice. I want to sort of briefly set the stage for this panel, and but before that, I think it probably makes sense to say a little bit about Vera. I see a lot of new faces in the room today, people that I haven't had the chance to meet, and I don't know whether you've had much interaction with Vera. So I think just to give you a sense of this place that you've come to visit today, Vera is a very special institution in the history of New York City. It is about 53 years old, which is a few ticks older than me. But we were founded in 1961 when we began doing work on Rikers Island to try to come up with a different way to enable people to go home while they were awaiting their trial. At that point, the only way that someone was able to get out of detention was if they could post bail. And the original founder of Vera learned about that, was disturbed at the notion that so many people who were low income and could not afford to post bail, that often at that point in 1961 dollars could be $25, $30, thought that it was a grave injustice and thought that there needed to be a better way. And in studying that and trying to come up with solutions, invented something called release on recognizance, and the notion that you could predict whether someone would show up to their further court proceedings based on what we call community ties, and based on whether they had a job, they had a family, they had a fixed address. And we tested that model back in 1961, and it proved to be very effective at both allowing people to go back home when they had been engaged by the criminal justice system, and they would then return for their further cases. I tell that story simply because it's a good way to describe the way Vera works. I often try to think about a pithy way to talk about Vera. I think, well, we're a think and do tank, or we're an innovation incubator, or something of that nature. And none of those things seem quite right, but the best way to really understand Vera is that we're a place that seeks to advance justice and fairness in the set of systems that people rely upon, both for safety and security. And we do that by taking knowledge and experimenting and working to change the systems that people interact with, and to test solutions. And then if they work, we try to spin them off into freestanding nonprofits, or to spin them into government. So we're literally sort of an experimentation shop. And if you look around the city, those of you who have thought a lot about justice issues or have interacted with them, you'll see many, many nonprofits in the city that are actually progeny of Vera, from the Neighborhood Defender Service to what was once called the Victim Services, now called Safe Horizons, the Center for Employment Opportunities, Cases. So I think over the course of our history, we have probably spun off about 17 different nonprofits, and then about 9 different units that now operate in government. So that's just a little bit about Vera. I want to say a quick thing. This is the third in a series that we're doing called Justice in Transition, New York. We thought it was very important because it was quite exciting with the new administration coming in to think about what the key justice issues were that were confronting New Yorkers and that should confront the new administration, and thought that it was that it was critical for us to start to frame that debate. We have had 2 of those sessions before. This one is the third, and we're going to have a 4th one on March 12th that is going to look at the interaction of mental health and criminal justice. That intersection between people who have mental health concerns and and criminal justice is not a great intersection. We know that many people are warehoused in Rikers who have mental health needs and substance abuse needs, and they don't get them adequately addressed. We know that the system does not do a good job of diverting those people out, and so on March 12th we'll have another panel that will look at those issues, from whether the city can improve its practices So maybe a little less law enforcement, maybe more about creating intervention teams to deal with people who have needs, maybe about diversion from that system altogether. We'll look at issues of segregation and isolation, which are hugely important here in New York. So stay tuned for that, and if you're interested, you can register on our website. Today's briefing is about advancing justice in a multicultural city, and there are two reasons why it's very important to me. One is a personal one. I'm the son of an African-American man who was born and raised in Bed-Stuy, and a Filipino mother who immigrated to this country in the 60s. And matters of justice and what they mean for people of color has been something that has driven me professionally for the last 2.5 decades. So I've thought about this a great deal. The second reason why it's very important, and one of the reasons why I was excited to come back and serve as president here at Vera, what I didn't say at the outset is I'm about 6 months into my stint here, is that when you look at the trajectory of this country, many of you in this room will know that we will be a majority minority country, or majority people of color country by 2040, 2042. And you saw when we looked at the 2008 and 2012 elections and the degree of participation among communities of color, that you got a sense of that trajectory. And so for me, it's become increasingly important. I think it's important for Vera to think with a great deal of purpose and to organize its work very much around what justice means in a country that will be majority people of color. That is our trajectory. It is, these are issues that many in this room have thought about before, but that is the future that we'll be heading towards. And when we get to 2040 or 2042 and the majority of our workforce are people of color and the majority of our taxpayers are people of color, and we need to think about what we need to do to make sure that people are positioned to advance economically and to have as much mobility as possible. It's very important to think about the justice system and what its interaction is with that big picture. And so really there's no better place to have this discussion than in New York City, because New York City is very much on the leading edge of this. We are a majority person of color community. I think 43% of the workforce in New York come from communities of color. If I have my facts right, I think 3 million of those of us who live in New York are actually foreign born, are immigrants. And so when you put all of that together, it really sort of sharpens the mind and makes one think about what are the main justice issues for the communities that make up the majority of New York. And if anyone has read the papers or sort of followed things or has been on the advocacy edge over the past few years, you'll know that issues around stop and frisk have predominated for the past few years. There's a great deal of concern around mass incarceration and its impact on communities of color. And I think we can stipulate that, and we won't end up talking much about that today, or we may. But one of the reasons why we thought it was very important to have this panel was to try to widen the lens a little bit and to figure out more about, what else? What are the other issues that we should be thinking about? What are the other issues that the de Blasio administration believes need to be advanced, not just within criminal justice, but in terms of economic justice more broadly? And what should we be encouraging our elected leaders here in the city and in the state to really be working on? So that's what we're going to do. So I'm very pleased to have a remarkable panel. We are lucky to have Marco Carrion, who is the Mayor's Community Affairs, head of the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit. We're going to talk about things ranging from municipal IDs to law enforcement and Arab, Middle Eastern, and Muslim and South Asian communities. We'll talk about a pilot that will provide counsel to indigent immigrants who are facing detention. We'll talk about wage theft. We'll get into all of that in a second. But before we do that, I just want to introduce our colleague Mirella Ivarak, who is a WNYC reporter. She has been there for 3 years. and covers immigration and poverty mostly. Mirella is going to lead this discussion. She'll moderate for us. She's a remarkable person. You've probably heard her voice on the radio. She won a Gracie Award as an outstanding reporter in 2013, and prior to her time at WNYC was also a freelance reporter for the Metro desk at the New York Times. So Mirella, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us, and it is all yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nick, for inviting me to moderate this great discussion. Just a few words at the beginning about the format of our panel. We're going to have each panelist talk for about 8 minutes about the issues they're working on. Then we're going to move on to sort of a free format discussion among the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll make sure there's plenty of time to ask those questions. We're live tweeting, so if you want to join us, the hashtag is Justice-NYC. And as I'm sure you've already noticed, our panelists' full bios are on your seats. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, starting from Marco Carrion, who is the new commissioner of the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit. He comes to this position from the New York City Central Labor Council, where he was political director. Susan Shaw is the program director for the Center on Immigration and Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice. She directs the United Communities Project here. Angela Fernandez is the executive director of the Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights, and Deborah Axe, the co-executive director of Make the Road New York. So Marco, I want to start with you. You're the head of the Community Affairs Unit. It's an office that has had a largely ceremonial role in the past. I understand Mayor de Blasio wants to change that. So can you talk a little bit about how that's going to happen?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? I know I have 2 mics. So first of all, I want to thank the Vera Institute for inviting me here today. You know, it's funny, a little aside. So I got announced, I think, like 5 weeks ago, but actually only started about 3.5 weeks ago. And as I sit down at my desk on my first day, my phone rings, and it's Mary from the Vera Institute asking me to appear on this panel. So, you know, the Vera Institute was their first group or organization to engage me, so I'm glad I actually was able to come to speak today. And I also am really humbled to be on such a high-powered, panel. I just met Susan today for the first time, but I've done a lot of work with both Angela and Deb, who are really leaders in their field, and so it's really amazing to be here. So going back to the question regarding CAU, in the past, CAU has had various kind of incarnations, iterations, mostly some political. In the last several years, it's been ceremonial, and not to take away from any of the work that was done under Commissioner Parvizi in the last administration, but they really focused on quality of life issues, rat abatement, graffiti, dealing with graffiti issues, tree planting, stuff that was very important to the past administration. This is a new administration and a new mayor. And this is a mayor who, if you follow his history and know his past, started out as an organizer. And CAU is a logical extension of his philosophy. So when I was tapped to, I didn't work in the campaign, as I know my bio is on the chairs. My background is mostly in the labor world, doing political work, doing political organizing work amongst various labor unions in the city. So when I was tapped to take on this role, we had a very clear conversation as to what his vision was. And it was the work that I had been doing previously, which was essentially empowering people, right? In the past, it had been workers, all workers, not just union members, but workers. And now it was a broader sense, just the citizens of the city. As I said, when I was appointed, usually community affairs, community engagement is kind of a check off the box thing. You say, I go to a community board meeting, I leave some pamphlets, and I walk away. If you take advantage of these services, you take advantage. I don't really know. But our focus is going to be different. It's going to be having conversations with folks beyond the kind of elected level, the community board level, and going deeper into communities. Really on a granular level, talking to folks, mapping out communities, figuring out who people actually talk to in their neighborhoods. And when we discover those nexus of where people get their information, kind of having conversations, seeing the services that folks are looking for, and also educating people. And at the end, hopefully getting people to the point where they advocate for themselves. So right now I'm working on issues like UPK is a big issue. So it's not just telling people, universal pre-K is good, you should follow the mayor's agenda, but really honing in on those populations who would be best served by the mayor's plan. Looking at people using demographic data, looking at people who actually have children of that age, looking at people who actually have not been able to access full-time quality universal pre-kindergarten, and talking to those folks and helping them essentially help us, deputizing them. So whether that means going up to a lobby day that we're having next Tuesday, whether it means speaking directly to their elected officials saying, I deserve these services, it's really a different way of looking at government, and government as an organizing tool, and government as really empowering people to be part of the system. And especially, as someone who's worked in this field for a long time, we're dealing with a really cynical populace, people who feel that government has failed them. And, my job is really to tell them that it hasn't, that this is the opportunity for them to become part of this movement.
So one issue that you'll be working on are municipal IDs. The mayor announced in his first State of the City that New York would offer IDs to residents no matter what their legal status is. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of services immigrants who don't have legal status would get access to?
Sure, municipal IDs, it's interesting. I mean, I talked about universal pre-K, Vision Zero, which was our plan to drop traffic fatalities to zero, hopefully in 5 years. But municipal IDs was another big campaign promise, and it was also something that the mayor made sure was in part of his State of the City address. And municipal IDs are essentially, what it says, it's pretty simple. People blow it up into different things, but it's giving a government-issued photo ID to New Yorkers, essentially so they can prove who they say they are, right? And this will allow them access right off the bat to government buildings, right? But city-owned government buildings, right? And city services. And it's as simple as that. Essentially, I know this debate has really honed in on the undocumented population, but I want to make it very clear that, when we talk about bringing people out of the shadows, it's not just the undocumented population. We're talking with municipal IDs, we're talking about runaways, we're talking about seniors, we're talking about people who are formerly incarcerated, we're talking about, homeless folks, we're talking about transgendered community. We're really talking about a wide range of people who either don't have the documentation, don't have the means, or the access to apply for other types of documentation. And we really want to, not allow that to be a barrier to have access to housing services, to financial services, and other public assistance as it exists for them.
Some critics have said that municipal IDs, quote, aid and abet illegal immigration and perhaps terrorism. What's your response to that?
It's patently false. The reality is, let's I feel very strongly about this because, this is the type of, I'm a veteran. As people have seen in my, bio, I did work for the last governor, Governor Spitzer, so I'm a veteran of what happened with the driver's license issue, and this is the same type of talking points that came out last time. These IDs provide access to people. And I think that we have to be very clear that we should not let, our concerns regarding security, which this administration is, very strong on, override our concern for people getting services which they deserve. But on the flip side, this actually provides increased security. We have people who are victims of violence or actually witness violence, witness crimes, who are afraid to actually go to the police, go to law enforcement because they're afraid they're going to be asked for an ID and not have it. So this actually gives people comfort to say, if I'm a victim of domestic violence, I can actually call 911. The police can come. I won't be scared because they'll say, let me see some ID and I don't have it. And they can actually report those crimes or report any other crimes they see. So in the way we see it, this actually makes us a more secure city.
Moving on from a change that's yet to come to something that's been happening for a while. After 9/11, a lot changed in the city, particularly for those communities who are collectively known as AMEMSA communities, that's Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian. So Susan, you here at Vera, here at Vera, you've been looking at the challenges and opportunities that exist in relations between those communities and local law enforcement. What did you find?
Well, I'd like to first start with talking about, when we're looking at justice for multicultural communities, it's best to look at where that initial contact first happens for these communities. And that oftentimes is with police. Local law enforcement need the trust and cooperation of the communities they serve for many reasons, but particularly for crime reporting and involvement in crime reduction activities. And in New York City, that's no easy task. It's a challenge to have the cooperation and the trust of a community as diverse as this. And as Nick mentioned, when you take account the foreign-born population, you've got immigration impacting 36% of the city. You've got language barriers that's impacting 25% of the city. You really see the scope of this challenge. And then, as you said, 9/11 was a game changer for all law enforcement, for federal law enforcement and for local law enforcement, where now Homeland Security was the overarching priority for everyone. And the impact of 9/11 did have a disparate response for members of the AMEMSA community, the Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. And we saw many situations where they were singled out as terrorists. They were victims of hate crimes, victims of employment discrimination, bullying, profiling. And this really impacted their relations with law enforcement. And we saw this happen, we saw the impact of 9/11 happen locally here in New York City. Some of you may remember in December of 2012, where a woman pushed a Hindu man to his death off of a subway platform in Queens. And when she was questioned, she said, "I've hated Hindus and Muslims ever since 2001. So when you're looking at AMEMSA communities or any communities, they can be valuable partners in ensuring public safety and ensuring Homeland Security. But local law enforcement around the country don't know how to build trust with them. This isn't being realized to the extent that it could be. There's a lot of fear and mistrust, particularly in New York. When you hear reports of surveillance of students groups, you hear of profiling that's happening, you hear of mapping of communities, of cricket clubs, of social clubs, of community spaces, faith-based organizations. And even if these practices are found to be legal, there is still significant fear and mistrust. Community advocates report that the fear and mistrust is actually at an all-time high right now, 12 years after 9/11. So this is why we launched our United Communities Project. We wanted to help local law enforcement and these communities work together in the spirit of community policing. And our project is a national project, and we sought to work closely with both police officials and community members to identify the challenges to these relations and to identify solutions. We worked in 3 sites around the country in California, New Jersey, and Ohio, and together with police and community, identified some solutions to these challenges. I'd like to just give you a quick snapshot of the challenges that we heard about. There's 3 main ones. The first one is that there's minimal positive interaction between local police and these communities. There's significant underreporting and really avoidance of police altogether amongst these communities. And this is due to instances of the surveillance or profiling or mapping that these communities are experiencing or hearing about. It's also due to a lack of knowledge amongst many members of these communities, particularly immigrants, but not just the immigrants, of the role of police. Local laws, community policing altogether is just a foreign concept to a lot of community members, whether you were born here or not. Language barriers are always an issue, and it was interesting, when we were working with law enforcement, more so than with any other community we've worked with, we heard that they thought language barriers didn't exist. And they do exist within these large, diverse, growing communities, and they're not really fully being utilized, or services are not being utilized. And then in general, there's just a lack of a notion of civic engagement from within these communities that needs to be bolstered. The third challenge that we heard about deals with what's happening in these police agencies themselves. There are disconnected practices happening with regard to AMEMSA populations. On one hand, you have counterterrorism units that have been formed after 9/11. Some of them are very robust. Some of them are county-wide. And these units are the ones that are actually making contact with members of the AMEMSA population. And they're not grounded in community policing, and they're not connected to the community policing or community outreach or any engagement arm that's been working in the community for much longer and has worked really hard to form a foundation for trusting relationships. You also see within these agencies a lack of focus on preventing or addressing hate crimes or bias incidents that are being perpetrated against these groups. Even with these challenges, we did hear in all three of our sites that among both police and community that there is this notion that community policing and homeland security cannot be mutually exclusive. They need to be integrated, and community policing needs to govern really what's happening when you're dealing with the community for any reason. Otherwise, all the gains that you've made on the community policing end will be undermined by homeland security efforts.
What would you suggest in New York City based on your research?
Well, based on what we saw in our project and the work that was done between police and community coming together and what was possible, and also based on my knowledge of what's happening here locally in New York City, I'd offer 5 things that the city should be considering when it comes to dealing with this issue. And they need to be considering it in partnership with members of the AMEMSA community. And I say this with the knowledge that among the 18,000 police agencies that exist in this country, the NYPD is the trendsetter. Every agency looks to the NYPD. The NYPD is known as being the most informed when it comes to policing. And this is an opportunity for the city. This is really an opportunity for the city to show how to do it right and do it well. First, I'd like to talk about civil rights and civil liberties. So my question is how can the city ensure that in protecting communities, ensuring public safety, ensuring homeland security, that they are protecting individual civil rights and civil liberties? And how is the NYPD rejecting discriminatory strategies? Second, recognizing that the NYPD has a robust research arm and they have many willing research partners in New York City and really the nation that would want to work with the agency. How are they evaluating existing counterterrorism practices, whether that includes mapping or surveillance or intelligence gathering, and ensuring that they're effective? And how are they accounting for any direct or indirect consequence to AMEMSA groups or other vulnerable groups? Third, when it comes to collaboration and partnership, how can the city ensure that active collaboration and partnership is being sought out with multiple groups that are vulnerable, including AMEMSA groups? And how can the NYPD perhaps measure and reward the hard work that is needed to build these sorts of partnerships and collaborations? Fourth, with regard to language access, how can the city ensure that language services that do exist in the city, I mean, we definitely have a lot of resources within the NYPD and beyond, how can the city ensure that language services are reaching those who are most vulnerable? And that includes domestic violence victims, victims of hate crimes, and other victims. And then finally, when looking at transparency and integrating all of this, how can the police department ensure that there is a culture of accountability and transparency, particularly when it comes to implementing policies and training initiatives for all law enforcement? And how can the expertise of initiatives like the New Immigrant Outreach Unit of the NYPD or other community policing initiatives be fully institutionalized and integrated through the entire agency of 40,000 police officers, and so that they are not undermined by Homeland Security?
Thank you, Susan. Let's turn to another challenge immigrants face in the justice system. Immigration law, unlike criminal law, does not guarantee a right to government-funded counsel. But a report in 2011 found that only 3% of immigrants in New York City who appear in immigration court while detained and unrepresented have successful outcomes of their cases. So the City Council decided last year to fund a pilot program called the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project. Angela, tell us about the program and why your organization decided to get involved.
Sure. Excuse me. So just imagine for a moment right now as we are sitting here together that there are hundreds of New York City residents that are languishing in detention right now across the river in New Jersey. Think also about the employer right now who is wondering why their employee is a no-show for days, has no idea why. Think about the little girl that right now is sitting in her home room, not knowing if she's ever going to see her father again. And the reason why this is happening is because detained immigrants in the United States do not have a right to counsel if they cannot afford an attorney. And that is a travesty. That it's occurring in this country is an absolute travesty. Our organization, Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights, is a community-based organization that serves the population directly. We are a storefront organization. We get phone calls every day from detention centers with people desperately seeking counsel. Many of them call saying that they have a lawyer. They've paid $10,000, but the lawyer has done nothing for them. For low-income immigrants, $10,000 can be their life savings. We have family members coming into our office with their children saying that they are about to be evicted because their spouse, who was the main bread earner, is now in detention and he is not there to be able to make money and help pay the rent. So this is a very, very desperate situation for our community. And so when Federal Judge Katzman put together the Blue Ribbon group of expert attorneys to study this issue and then came up with the recommendations, we were then approached by Cardozo Law School, Vera Institute, and CPD, and asked if we could join their campaign, which we were extremely excited to join the campaign because we see on a daily basis what happens when an immigrant not only does not have a right to an attorney or may have an attorney that is of very low quality. So what has occurred since we joined the campaign about a year ago is that City Council, in its foresight, has decided to pilot the program at the cost of $500,000. What that does is that it funds 20% of the individuals that are detained right now. Already we have seen the benefits of this. Over 100 people have been represented. Over 20% of them have been immediately released. So just think of that. If it weren't for this program, those individuals would still be languishing in detention and may very well be deported back to their country of origin, or in some cases, I know in one case, the lawyer was able to identify through this pilot program that a person was about to be deported to a country that was not their country. So what this pilot is showing is that there are a tremendous amount of unknowns, not only for the individual that is sitting in detention by themselves, not knowing what they're supposed to do when they are presented in front of a judge and having to argue, quote unquote, argue a case against a government trained attorney, usually without the language skills, let alone the legal skills. Imagine that now we're discovering all of these other issues because we have attorneys now that are looking at these cases. A number of them, for example, are children or young adults who actually have a right to a green card, not even just simply, a potential stay of removal, but a right to a green card. Again, if it weren't for these attorneys, they never would have learned that. So we're excited that this program is actually now going to continue, and about 100 more people are going to be represented. But that's still only a part of the story. We need this program to be expanded, to be baselined and made permanent in the city's budget so that every single New Yorker who finds themselves in this incredibly complex system, which is the detention and deportation system, actually have a fighting chance. And one thing I really want to note here also is that this isn't about a change in law. These people actually have a right to stay. So why not ensure that this right to stay is exercised? And all that's needed is an attorney at a very affordable rate.
Angela, this is a pilot program. So what is going to happen in the next fiscal year? So
what we're having very positive conversations with the City Council and also with the Mayor's office from the City Council points of view is to have this be expanded and hopefully made permanent. And we're actually going to start having conversations with the Mayor's office about this as well.
Thank you. So moving on from a project that's in its early stages to something that's been on the books for a few years. The National Law Employment Project found that in 2010, they did a report and found that every year in New York City, around $1 billion was stolen in wages from low-wage workers. We know that they're disproportionately immigrants. Make the Road was pushing hard for the New York Wage Theft Prevention Act, which was then passed in 2010. Deborah, can you tell us about the law and the kind of difference it's already making?
So thank you so much. It's great to be here. I mean, wage theft is really one of the worst crime waves in history, right? So it's true, $1 billion a year stolen from working families in New York City alone by their employers in the form of wage theft, right? It is 4 times minimum more likely that you'll be a victim of wage theft, and there's 4 times more money stolen in the form of wage theft, right, than in bank robberies, convenience stores, gas stations, and all other forms of retail robbery combined. And I'm talking about across the country, right? And so in New York City alone, the wage theft outweighs bank robberies and all those kinds of robberies nationwide. Right? And so we're talking about massive scale. The form that wage theft takes really varies. So it can be anything from the typical restaurant worker in New York City works about 7 days a week, sometimes 6, usually 12-hour shifts, and often makes $20 a shift, right? It can be a car wash worker who is required to show up to work, and then the car wash is closed because it's snowing, and they're sent home with 0 pay, despite the fact that they've worked 3 hours and spent 3.5 hours commuting and paying for their Metro card. It can be a bank worker for one of the top 5 banks in the country, getting millions of dollars in New York City and New York State subsidies, where the worker is timed to the second that they're only allowed a maximum of 2 minutes in the bathroom, and they're kept after work to close up the cashier's drawer, things like that at the end of the day. Right? So we're talking about small employers, we're talking about huge employers that control the global economy, we're talking about little stores, nail salons, and we're talking about big warehouses that really control the flow of food within our city. I mean, our analysis of what happens and why wage theft is so rampant, right, is really that there are 3 big things. First of all, there is virtually no chance you will get caught for wage theft. So if any employers are here that want to act unscrupulously, I can give you some intelligent business advice. There is virtually no chance you will be caught. For a number of reasons. One is that since the 1960s, the number of investigators at the New York State Department of Labor, which is the major entity charged with enforcement of wage theft, has plummeted. We now are around 100 investigators. It would take 200 investigators to get to the staffing levels of the 1960s. During that time period, the number of low-wage jobs has, of course, skyrocketed. Right, and so we're seeing a disproportionate impact there. And the backlog at the New York State DOL right now, we just did a study at Make the Road New York of about 380 cases that we've been tracking for the last several years. At least 50% of the cases, when a worker actually comes forward to file a claim for wage theft, right, they actually call the cops. That's the equivalent of calling the cops in the wage theft scenario. They will wait at least 1 year for their investigation to begin. So you can imagine in a bank robbery setting, calling the cops and them telling you, we've assigned a detective to your case, they will call you in a year to gather interviews. Right? And so that is what happens right now if you dare to go report a wage theft occurrence. Of course, another big factor is that retaliation works. So many unscrupulous employers threaten to have people's friends and relatives deported, right? Threaten firing, of course, is the basic and simple thing. And one well-timed threat, much less one well-timed firing, can silence an entire workforce and all the folks who hear about it. Then thirdly, if you're caught, the penalties have historically been pathetic. So historically, the penalties, if you're caught, actually never even rose to the level of having to pay back what you would have paid those workers had you been not stealing their wages all along. And so it just made good business sense to go ahead and steal workers' wages because you might only have to pay back a percentage. Now, this area is where we really made some dramatic improvements with the Wage Theft Prevention Act in 2010. So we were able to quadruple the liquidated damages that workers can get for wage theft. So you now get double damages looking back 6 years, which is really the strongest in the nation. And so we were able to make a big dent in that particular problem. But the third big problem is that many employers can wriggle out from under a judgment, even if caught, even if prosecuted, even if they make it through the DOL backlog, or even if they're sued in private lawsuits. And that is because, and this of course gets to the more egregious and shady employers, but it is really remarkable how easy it is to have assets disappear or put your house in your girlfriend's name or empty your bank account. We actually had a worker literally standing in the bank next to their employer the other day, and the employer laughed in their face while they emptied their bank account and handed the cash to their girlfriend to put it in her name. And there was virtually nothing that could be done. And this is a somewhat obnoxious and egregious example, but there's virtually nothing that could be done because the case was still pending in court. And under current law, even if you're in active litigation, even if the judge believes, based on all obvious evidence, that the employer is moving assets to avoid the judgment, they actually are not authorized to freeze those assets, right, pending the judgment. So these are sort of the three big areas. The Wage Theft Prevention Act, as I mentioned, made dramatic reforms in the penalties, made substantial reforms in protection against retaliation. So immigrant workers now are protected against threats, for example. We have seen employers actually, their cousin, actually, we had an employer's cousin who actually stalked one of our members and slashed him on the street with a knife. And it was not at the time illegal because it was not the employer himself who had done this, right? And so trying to get the cops to pay attention to a wage theft retaliation case is obviously not really top of the list of priorities. So we were able to make those kinds of egregious cases also illegal. And we tightened up a lot of loopholes to make enforcement real. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with the lack of resources for enforcement, and we're turning now to the next phase of what needs to happen. And we're really thrilled, obviously, to have the changeover in city administration as well, because there is a lot of work that the city can do to really start cracking down on wage theft.
Continuing on that, Deborah, what are some of the next steps that this law doesn't encompass?
Yeah, so the next steps are, first of all, just real policing. We need to get boots on the ground for enforcement. And largely it's the state's job to do this, the feds as well. But the city can help with outreach, with support for community-based organizations to really get out there and connect with workers and support them to use the anti-retaliation protections that exist and help encourage people to come forward with some backup. The second thing is that we really need to start implementing zero tolerance in city and state licenses and contracts for wage theft. So it's rampant, but there are contractors and employers who take public dollars, public subsidies, and have public contracts that we need to crack down on. And then finally, we really need to work on improving collections. And this is something where we're going to need the city to work with the state. But some of the things like enabling attachment of assets and really just resourcing the policing necessary to hunt down the worst bad actors in those kinds of cases so that workers can see justice.
Thank you, Deborah. Marco, I want to return back to municipal IDs, and there's a lot of excitement that's being generated around it. But what we already know is that a lot of immigrants do have access to these services because many financial and other institutions accept different forms of IDs, including consular IDs, foreign passports. So with this project, you'll be trying to reach a part of the population that doesn't have already access to credit or debit cards or leases. And those are also the people who are harder to reach. So what are your thoughts in terms of how you're going to reach those people? And any thoughts from the advocates on that would be also great.
Well, I mean, the first thing we'll do is rely on a lot of the advocates to help us out, obviously reach, those populations. We definitely don't try to either reinvent the wheel or to pretend that we have relationships that we don't have. And, beyond the services that we will initially offer, right, which is access, we will also look at what other municipalities have done in terms of, enhanced benefits. So whether it be the ability to open a bank account, discounts and other services with partner organizations. Some municipalities have had like a charge card or debit card type feature. So all those things are on the table. Obviously, as you get more complex with the services you offer, it adds, becomes tricky in terms of making sure that the functions work properly. And we have spent a lot of time in the mayor's office of immigrant affairs. Has spent a lot of time kind of researching where this has been done and trying to figure out the best practices.
There are already 10 municipalities that have it.
That have this already. So, you have, New Haven and Oakland and San Francisco that have this already. So, and it's kind of like basing our steps and outreach on what's already been done, and also using our network. So, but yeah, the advocates play a huge role in this, in all those sectors.
And we're working together with Make the Road on the municipal ID. One of the things that came out of New Haven is that New Haven reported a 20% decrease in crime since the municipal ID was instituted, and they think that it has to do with the fact that immigrants feel more comfortable going to the police now with an actual ID to engage with them, to talk about any crimes they may have seen. And additionally, for our community, which is really at the crosshairs within the detention and deportation system, we think that it will be very helpful in their feeling comfortable in approaching the police and not worry about being pulled into the detention system.
Deborah and Susan, you both kind of touched upon the issue of the fear that still exists among immigrants in terms of reporting, whether it be crimes, wage theft. So in New York City, the police, city agencies are not allowed to ask people about their immigration status. A lot of work has been done on this issue. How prevalent is that fear? To what extent does it still exist among immigrants?
I mean, I think it's huge. I think it's huge. And even if the city doesn't have a system or doesn't ask immigration status, there's so many other mechanisms. There's a national program called Secure Communities, which basically ensures that anybody who's arrested and gets their fingerprints taken will come to the notice of immigration authorities. So I mean, the fear is there, and there are things that the city can do to ensure, that people feel safe here, but, they can't eliminate the fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the work that's been done on language access issues with a lot of the folks in this room over the last decade has really made a huge difference, and that this city, as compared to other cities across the country, is, of course, a much better place to be an immigrant. That said, especially given the undermining impact of abusive policing, I think we really have a lot to do to make sure that the trust is there. Certainly, Make the Road members often end up with us because it feels like a place that you can be safe, that you can be yourself, and people are generally still pretty intimidated to go to some government offices and really engage with the government. So we need to really close up those gaps.
Mm-hmm. Angela, the pilot program that you talked about has been funded by about $500,000. Mm-hmm. I know the City Council is now asking for $5.3 million. Mm-hmm. It's a huge increase. What would that money allow you to do? And maybe, Marco, you can possibly chime in on where the administration stands on that.
Get your checkbook out.
So the 5.3 million would provide representation for the 900 immigrants that go through Varick Court every year, and the 750 New York residents that go through the Newark and Elizabeth courthouse. And so when you break it out, it comes out to about $3,000 per client for the year, which actually is a very, very reasonable amount of money. Typically, a deportation defense attorney would charge $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. And so when you consider that this pilot program, which is the attorneys are from Brooklyn defenders and Bronx defenders who have been doing an excellent job, it's not just the attorneys themselves, it's the fact that they have a robust wraparound services that involve interpreters, although all the attorneys seem to be tri and quadrilingual, social workers, investigators. And so it's very important to understand and to note that the reason why this program should be done in the way that we've been doing it in this pilot is because of the robust services that can be provided compared to a single or standalone deportation defense attorney. So this would be, not only is this beneficial for the individuals and for the family members, but there are savings that are borne out to the system as well, to the extended system. So, for example, the foster care system to employers. They lose a tremendous amount of money when they lose an employee and have to retrain new employees. The education system, the dropout rate of children of deportees is very high. The obesity rate of children of deportees is 80%. So those are health implications there. And so Center for Popular Democracy, in partnership with the other organizations that are part of this campaign, put out a white paper that really detailed the other ancillary economic costs that are real costs to both the city and the state of New York. So when you think about that $3,000 per person, it's almost the cost zero to the city of New York.
So obviously they do a great job. I was lucky enough, I think it was last week or the week before last, as a guest of council member Carlos Menchaca, who's the head of the immigration committee of the city council, to actually observe for about an hour the proceedings, and speak to Professor at Cardozo, who was there. And it was really harrowing stuff. Sitting there, very close in a room, a quarter of this size, watching the events in front of you. So this is something that we're obviously seriously considering, and Angela and Deb and Javier from Make the Road are obviously very good advocates. So all these facts we have, and we're seriously considering this.
It's all to make the city look good.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I think, Angela, one thing that should be mentioned that I've certainly noticed in observing those hearings is that it's not always about trying to help people stay in the country. Sometimes lawyers recognize that people don't have a good case, and then it also helps with the backlog that exists in immigration courts, which is currently huge. It's 360,000 cases that are pending.
So, and this, I have to commend the Vera Institute for this. Once the pilot program was, when we were informed that we would be funded, Vera Institute worked very quickly to bring in all the stakeholders being the immigration judges, the ICE council, even ICE security, because they're the ones who are responsible for moving the detainees from the detention center over to the court. And so over multiple meetings, they were able to establish some norms that allowed for the very first day of cases to run smoothly, and since then continue to run smoothly. And so here's an example of where government really works. And again, it's because of the Vera Institute just having just a lot of forethought and planning. What I've heard actually from the defense attorneys is that they've actually been so impressed at how helpful the ICE attorneys have been. And part of this is because of the efficiencies that have been developed. Now, I don't think any of us, at least the advocates, would ever say that it's good for the detention deportation system to be efficient. That's part of the problem that we have. But because the reality is we are working within the system with this issue and trying to improve it from inside the system, the fact of the matter is that if a person does not have any viable legal option to stay in the United States, then being back in their country of origin may be better than having them spend a year, 2 years in detention without any option for relief. And again, I say this with a lot of hesitancy because we as an organization have done what's called the community pressure and have gotten actually people released through community pressure. But that's something that's for another conversation.
Thank you. I want to open it now to the questions from the audience. So who has the first question?
I actually have a twofold question.
If you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Mariana Grigsby, and I'm a legal intern in the Center for Immigration and Justice here at Vera. My question is, you made reference to municipal IDs when you were talking about the driver's license initiative. And I think my question is, when you build up the goodwill for a movement like municipal IDs, sometimes what happens is the first time there's a story that's somewhat negative about an undocumented immigrant, all of a sudden a lot of that goodwill is eroded. And I'm just wondering what are ways in which you can prevent that in order to make sure that an initiative like that goes through.
Do you mean the goodwill on behalf?
I'm saying so for example, with driver's license, a lot of times what happened is, so people were organizing around it, and there would be one story where there may have been a car accident involving an undocumented immigrant, and the story completely changed. And so a lot of the goodwill became sort of, all of the positives became sort of like the secondary story. And I feel like a lot of times with movements like this that can have a great impact, a lot of times when there's one negative story, the movement sort of falls apart in a way, or has a setback. And so I'm just wondering, what are ways in which to ensure that those things don't happen?
Yeah, one thing I've learned from in being in this administration is that, or in my first month at job, is that this administration has very thick skin, right? So, we've already weathered the storm on snow, right? and some pothole stuff. If you look at the other things we've done, such as, paid sick days, right? Before I had this job, I was in the Central Labor Council, as I said, as a political director. And one of my main roles for the last year and a half was pushing the paid sick days initiative through, right? And this is something that we got a lot of heat from the press on, right? And not only was the public advocate, at the time, the public advocate supportive, but when he became mayor, not only worked to kind of make sure it actually was implemented, but also enhanced. You're seeing the same stuff on racial profiling with the Floyd appeal, right? These aren't popular. They're popular in some sectors, right? But the last administration spent a lot of time, with editorial boards, with other groups, to show why paid sick days would cost the city millions of jobs, why we needed to continue stop and frisk, why it kept us safe. I think with the things that we've outlined as our top priorities, which municipal IDs, obviously, as being the State of the City address was, these are part of our core values, and that's all. That's all an administration has. This is not a poll, kind of finger in the air which way the wind is blowing administration. This is going straight ahead with a clear vision. So,
In the back.
Hi, I'm Kate Rubin from Theater of the Oppressed NYC. My question is for Susan, I think. Yeah, I was interested in the 5 questions, essentially, that you had for the NYPD. And I think that some of them have been going around and around for a while, and especially the question of partnership with communities, transparency, communication. I was wondering if you have any, sorry, I can see you, if you have any, if there are any kind of creative solutions that you've heard of recently. I feel like, we work with cases and we hear there's a lot of desire for youth police dialogue, but aside from kind of getting people to sit around in a room, which I don't think anyone really wants, they don't want to do it, what are the creative ways that people are thinking about to make those partnerships or the transparency happen?
I think creativity is important when it comes to police relations with members of the population, but when it comes to police, it's not really about creativity, it's about leadership. And really who's leading the agency of 40,000 officers, and there needs to be a commitment from the top down. Police departments are paramilitary organizations, right? They have a structure, they have a command, structure, and so, what we need is the police chief, the leader of the agency, to be focusing on this and prioritizing this. And some of you who followed this issue with AMEMSA community relations know that Chief Bratton, when he was with the LAPD, had a situation where there was a desire to map Muslim communities, and there was a lot of pushback, and they worked with the communities, and they decided not to do it. That doesn't speak necessarily to partnerships, but it really is kind of a top-down piece, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen with one forum. It's not going to happen with, an isolated unit that's going out to libraries and doing engagement activities, which are important, but it can't just be that. It has to be all the way through the agency from the top down.
My question is, are you considering working with prosecutors and also, in general, thinking about serious criminal justice reform because I've been a lawyer for longer than I care to admit, and watched the criminal justice system get harsher and harsher and harsher over 30 years that I've been here, with the idea that harsh penalties actually implement change in people's behavior, which it doesn't. So what happens now is it doesn't reduce crime. Harsh penalties don't reduce crime. And so now you have all these people who are getting deported because of really minor convictions that have become harsher than they really should be. You have people that can't work because, and are much more subject to the kind of wage theft that you're talking about. So a lot of these issues are affected by the harsh criminal justice laws and prosecutorial, the implementation of prosecutorial discretion. So I just want to know if you guys have thought about that, or, is there something you could consider around that? Because the city has a lot of ability to go to Albany and say, most of the people that get arrested are in the city. And obviously I know there's a lot going on, other issues, but I think over time, maybe not this week, but over the next few years, it could be really helpful for the city to have a position that it doesn't want its citizens subject to these really harsh laws that have been passed by people that don't have the same philosophy that I think we do.
Yeah, I guess I'll speak first. Yeah, I mean, you pointed out a lot of this is, rests in the hands of Albany and the feds. I mean, I was going to say unfortunately, but the reality is that, the city is a creature of Albany, and I'm sure you've all seen the paper, the battle that we've been having with the state legislature on, various issues. But I think that, when we speak of, like, once again, going back to the campaign theme of the two cities, right? Even one of the things you're talking about is, unjust penalties. And I think it's something that, we are looking at. I mean, we have a very expansive agenda, and I think there's something that we'll be looking at down the road.
If I can just interject, the city has already twice limited its cooperation with the Department of Homeland Security in 2011 and 2013. So through the program Secure Communities, where the Department of Homeland Security gets access to fingerprints of people who are arrested and put in jails, the city has limited exactly, and when they issue a detainer asking for a person to be held in jails, the city has limited to whom they will, in which cases they will honor these detainers. I don't know, Angela, if you want to add anything to that?
Well, yes, the city has definitely passed two bills, but it's a very good, excellent first step. But when you compare it to other cities around the country, there are other cities who actually have said that absolutely no one who's detained is going to be in the criminal detention is going to be transferred over to immigration detention. So right now the bill protects about a quarter of the people that are at Rikers Island or in the police precincts. So yes, it's definitely excellent, and we're looking forward to it expanding and covering more people that should not be transferred over into the immigration detention system, which has, based on this conversation, has no due process protections.
There are plans to do that, as I hear.
Yes, no, there are.
Hi, good morning. My name is Crystal. I'm a graduate student at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. I have a question about accessing farm worker communities, and this may be outside of the scope of the panel discussion.
The network of advocates and legal services providers upstate is great, but thin, right? Just drastically underfunded. So it's safe to say that there's a huge area of need there. The Wage Theft Prevention Act did improve the law for farm workers, but there are still major gaps where farm workers are not fully covered by the wage theft protections that we have now in place, which are, though I complained about, the general state of lack of enforcement, are still the best laws in the books in the country. So, I think that's a real problem. We particularly have a presence on Long Island, but not upstate. And there is an emerging alliance of worker centers upstate focusing on farm workers and others. But again, the funding streams are very, very thin. So it's a big problem and challenge for the future.
And with regard to detention and deportation, we also have a statewide campaign to ensure that people who are detained in Batavia, for example, have right to counsel as well. And because Customs and Border Patrol has a jurisdiction of 100 miles from the border to be able to make any stops and ask people as if you're crossing the border, but you're just crossing the street, for proof that you're in the country legally, many people are getting swept up, and many of them are actually farm workers. So part of the campaign is to engage farm worker organizations and the farm owners as well.
Good morning. I'm Kelly Giles. I'm an undergraduate at Hunter studying gender and urban sociology. And Marco, my question is for you. You spoke about the municipal IDs, and I appreciate the inclusive effort, the elderly, undocumented workers. But my question speaks to the trans community. And, transgender is new to a lot of people. People just don't really quite understand what it is or how it kind of fits into our social framework. And I'm curious to know what steps are being taken or what organizations you're working with to kind of help people understand what trans means and what it means to get an ID and actually have to choose a gender, and how we're trying to educate people so that they are a little bit more sensitive to the trans community and their plight as an other group.
Yeah, and I mentioned that as one of the populations that we were going to be reaching out to, for a reason, because people do have to put down, and other IDs have to put down, identify a gender. We are presently formulating a plan to deal with or to do outreach to all the populations I talked about and to educate. The reality is that I joked before about the advocates being so good, but it's really like I see CAU as really being a hub of educating the city through a lot of groups that already exist, right, and who already have the best practices. So I do have 2 folks in my unit who are liaisons to the LGBTQ community. And, it's going to be their job to really reaching out to the various organizations to get, that information out. And, the big thing for me is, and I said this when I was appointed, is it's not only in the traditional areas that people think about, like Manhattan, right? But, as a Bronxite, I'm well aware of the large, forgotten population in the Bronx, of color that exist, who have a very rough time, and that's why, one of the liaisons in my office is, from the Bronx, is a person of color. Actually, they're both people of color. So, that's something that I'm very sensitive to. So, yeah.
Susan, you mentioned mapping a few times. I was wondering, obviously there are privacy concerns with mapping, but also it could probably be used to increase service delivery to these communities. Do you think there's a way that it could be done in a positive way?
Yeah, and Marco talked about how, you guys are thinking about doing mapping for service delivery. I mean, it really is looking at what the purpose is and having a purpose, to be honest, that is defensible and that is targeted towards learning about what their needs are. But definitely, and I don't know if you want to talk more about your mapping.
No, it's funny that you mentioned that because when Susan was giving her presentation, I said, maybe I shouldn't use that word in the future, right?
The name.
And I said, but yeah, it is, like I had a long conversation with folks from HRA recently, and they talked about how they determine where they do outreach, and it's really looking at, and we have a really great demographic unit in city planning. That I know a lot of groups and advocates have get information from. And it's really using that information. So
don't call it a demographics unit either. That's what it might be.
See the reason I come to these panels is so I can learn. I'm a natural listener, so I take all these notes in my head. So, but yeah, really for us, it's just really figuring out where people are. It's really that. It's just. We just want to be effective and talk to the right people and not be, I guess, I use that term because I want people to understand that I don't want, CAU is not going to be passive in terms of its education, right? So it's not just, like I said, throwing a pamphlet on the floor and saying, it's up to you to read this stuff, right? But actually looking at the other way and just working hand in hand and making sure people actually, whether it be all the language access, that programs that we have and tools that we have, or whatever, resources that we have in city government to make sure that it's delivered to the right population.
We call it a community connection survey.
Community connection survey. I'm gonna write that down. Look at that. Thank you, Susan.
Any other questions? Okay, in that case, let's give a hand to our panelists.
It's great doing the panel with you guys.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And I was honest when I said that.
Yeah.